you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world.
80 years since tens of thousands of Allied servicemen stormed ashore at Normandy, France. It was called D-Day. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower called the invasion the Great Crusade. The challenge now is keeping alive the memories of that Great Crusade. Barry Peterson reports from Paris, France, and New Orleans.
Watch closely at this moment that will one day be gone forever.
That first time in combat, do you remember being nervous, or do you feel like your training had prepared you for that moment, or what were your feelings going into that?
You're always nervous when you know you're going to be in combat. And you're always nervous after you've been in combat. But for me, and I think most of my contemporaries, when we're in combat, no nerves at all, just doing your job.
A moment when you can talk to a World War II veteran like 99-year-old Steve Ellis, a gunnery officer on a Navy invasion landing craft in the Pacific.
I can still remember that we were on a resupply run in which we were under constant attack for 3 days, and I never got to bed.
He shares his stories at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans with seniors like Luke Suggs from Holy Cross High School.
What does it mean to you to hear him say that as opposed to reading it in a book?
I think it's very interesting at that moment, for me personally, to realize I'm really talking to someone who went through this and who was there that day.
Can't get it from a book, don't get it from a movie.
Exactly.
Got to get it from the guy.
Yes.
The guy who can tell you face to face exactly why he did it.
When people ask you, Steve, like, what was the point of the war in your mind? Why were you there? What do you answer?
Well, I guess I was there because it was expected of my generation that we take up the cause.
The cause as what?
Of freedom.
More than 16.4 million Americans served during the war. Today, fewer than 100,000 are left. And with the greatest generation almost gone, the museum is working hard to reach new generations. Like providing high school yearbooks from the war years as part of the course material sent to students across the country, says Chrissy Gregg, who heads the museum's education outreach.
Obviously the hairstyles are different, the slang, but there's some common things. There is chess club, and there is basketball, and there's prom.
Well, that really helps because now you're really talking about young people of the same age looking at the greatest generation when they were that age.
Yeah.
I can understand how that would really resonate.
Certainly.
The museum sends student reporters to places like Normandy, young people sharing stories with other young people.
A prominent observation point between Omaha and Utah Beach. This site earned the name Bloody Omaha.
Mark and Lisa Kramer taught D-Day by taking their children, Grant and Caroline, to Normandy. But first, Mark made them watch D-Day in the opening scenes of Saving Private Ryan.
Grant had quite a bit of interest at that point in World War II, and I think it made it sink in a little deeper that war is a really terrible thing.
Grant, a high school sophomore, brought home a modern-day lesson.
We were a nation united behind the cause of democracy and freedom, and it seems like you have people today in our government, putting democracy up as a debate when it shouldn't be, especially not in the United States of America.
This is the Sherman tank.
Mike Bell spent his Army career in tanks and praises the ingenious tactics Allied soldiers used against the Germans.
So, for instance, they might fire white phosphorus smoke over a German tank, and it would suck the air into the German tank, and the crew would evacuate the tank. In American history,
he is executive director of the Jenny Craig Institute for the Study of War and Democracy at the museum. He can ponder the very real what if.
So what would have happened if D-Day had failed?
If D-Day had failed, what's incredible is there's no backup plan. I think you could imagine that the oppressed peoples would not be liberated, or certainly would not be liberated in 1944 and 45. You can imagine the extent of the Holocaust, the other oppression, slave labor, how those would have continued under Nazi domination for years.
But it didn't fail. By day's end, the Allies had 156,000 servicemen on French soil in a week, more than 320,000.
In late August, in a major boost to Allied morale, American soldiers got their first glimpse of the Eiffel Tower as they fought their way into Paris and liberated the city. But there would be a lot more war to come. The Allies swept across France and into Germany until May of 1945, 11 months after the first soldiers came ashore at Normandy. The job was done. Germany surrendered.
And at the same time, the Allies were waging a separate war in the Pacific to defeat the Japanese. As shown in this museum exhibit called The Road to Tokyo.
We try to create immersive environments.
Stephen Watson is the museum's president and CEO.
Real documents, real weapons, real uniforms, real armaments, helmets, maps, real things tell stories in a way that's authentic.
I feel like we're in a battle. I mean, you've created some of the sound, some of the effect, literally some of what the service people were going through.
That's right. It's a little bit overwhelming by design.
And other exhibits show how the war is part of our lives today.
If you think about jet engine technology, nuclear power, computers, medicine, plasma, the origins of a lot of the things that impact our daily lives today go back to this period of innovation when we needed solutions during World War II.
An estimated 2,500 Americans died just on D-Day. Fathers, husbands, sons, best friends. At the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial, each name has a story, each one worthy of honor. And teaching the story of their bravery to new generations is the debt we owe them. That is our debt of honor. For CBS Saturday Morning, Barry Peterson, Paris.
An incredible museum. It started off as a National D-Day museum off the real effort of Stephen Ambrose, the author of Band of Brothers. He wanted people to understand the sacrifice of Easy Company that went all the way to Berlin. And in so doing, they realized, you know what? We don't have a national museum on World War II, and we're going to make one here. And New Orleans, really banded together to make it happen.
It is amazing, those first-person accounts. Those are the things that we are losing. And when you see a child or somebody younger hear it, all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
And it's always good to be reminded of that selfless greatest generation in this age of self-promotion and everything else, just the sacrifice involved.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Some of the last living World War II veterans are in Normandy to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. Crowds welcomed dozens of World War II vets and some D-Day vets on Monday. Many of them are over 100 years old. On June 6, 1944, more than 150,000 Allied troops, including 73,000 Americans, landed in France to drive out Nazi Germany forces. More than 2,500 U.S. soldiers died on that day alone. CBS News correspondent Elaine Cobb is at the American Cemetery in Normandy, France. So, Elaine, it is so important that we honor both those who we've lost and also those who are still here to tell the story and what they went through. How are they being honored?
Lindsay, there are commemorative ceremonies all along the beaches of Normandy. Every town and village has its own event on. There are commemorative events where people who lived through the war as children are meeting up with local children to tell them what happened. There are veterans from the Allied nations, and the US veterans who have made it back, just more than a handful, will be honored here at Colville Cemetery, which is the American cemetery where most of those who died were buried. And the ceremony on June 6th will be hosted by President Biden, and during it, French President Emmanuel Macron will give the Legion of Honor to 11 US vets who were here during World War II. And that is partly to say, we appreciate what you did, and a big thank you from France.
I'm sure you're talking to people about the significance of these ceremonies and different events. Why are they telling you that it is important to look back on history?
There's a lot of talk about how we really need to learn the lessons from history, and we're just not doing it. The war that engulfed Europe in the 40s was so huge that people said it can't happen again, and yet we have war in Europe, in Ukraine, and there's a lot of concern about that. There are a lot of parallels being also shown here. And a lot of people from Ukraine who were refugees in France, who were sort of looking what's happening here and saying, yes, it's kind of strange. And there's a lot of concern that people will no longer have the living voices to listen to. So there's very much a need to pass on through the generations to the younger people and get as much oral history and written history as they can from those still alive.
That is so important. I'm so glad you touched on that. Living voices. I mean, many of these people are more than 100 years old. I want to ask you before we let you go, Elaine, what the mood is like in Normandy.
It is amazing. Everyone here is involved in some way. There are more than 1 million tourists here this year, visitors for the ceremonies. They have come from across Europe, from the US, from Canada, from Britain, and they're all here to pay tribute to the veterans. And some will never get anywhere near the ceremonies, but there are also many reenactors here. Quite a number of people are dressing in uniforms, driving around in jeeps, and they say that it's their way of paying tribute to the men who died here at Omaha Beach and all along the Normandy coastline.
Incredible. Thank you for bringing that to us, Elaine.
It's 80 years since Allied troops landed on the beaches of Normandy to confront Nazi soldiers, an event known as D-Day. The remarkable feat is considered the largest land, air, and sea assault in world history. It took over a year to plan the Operation Overlord, which was the plan that started with the Normandy landings and ended with the liberation of France from German control. Now, more than 156,000 men were deployed to France, and that includes approximately 18,000 paratroopers who dropped over German lines just hours before ground troops arrived to secure critical sites. And on D-Day, soldiers from 12 different nations were all working together, a rare feat in military history for a single operation. Some were allied forces like the U.S. and U.K., while resistance fighters from occupied nations like France and Czechoslovakia also joined the efforts. And the sheer amount of military equipment involved in D-Day obviously created logistical hurdles. According to the U.S. Department of Defense, there were about 11,500 aircraft assisting the ground troops that day, and some delivered paratroopers over their targets, while others took bombing runs over German factories and supply lines. And the actual delivery of those ground troop soldiers took more than 6,900 ships, the majority of which were British. And some of those boats were part of a diversion effort to make the Germans believe that the invasion was actually happening miles away in Pas-de-Calais instead of in Normandy. Now, D-Day was a major victory for the Allies, but it came at a hefty cost. 4,426 Allied soldiers, about half of whom were Americans, died during the invasion. And those soldiers' sacrifices and the efforts of other Allied soldiers resulted in the U.S. gaining a foothold in France that would be critical for liberating Europe.
To give us more context on all of this, we're bringing in now Kim Guise. She's the Senior Curator and Director for Curatorial Affairs at the National World War II Museum. It's great to have you with us today. What strikes me about what Lana just laid out is how much coordination this historic moment and effort took from different nations, perhaps with different motivations, but of course different people. Walk us through why it's so key to preserve this moment in history and its significance in not just that war, but everything that happened afterwards.
So, as you mentioned, this was a moment that took tremendous coordination from so many different individuals, leaders, nations. And it was a pivotal moment where the course of the war was really on the line. The Allied victory was not certain. So anything could have happened had we not been successful at the end of the day, and then in the coming months, the war would have looked very different. And so it's very important to look back on that moment and also to record those exactly how Americans, how the Allies coordinated to get this done.
And the museum that you have is featuring a new exhibit called Voices from the Front. I've been really privileged to interview some veterans of World War II, but there are fewer and fewer around every year. So talk to us about why it's so important to hear these stories directly from the veterans.
Exactly. So These, there are less than 1% of all American veterans living today. And so I've been with the museum for many years, and initially there were dozens of veterans here telling us their stories directly, telling visitors, telling school groups, and that is almost unheard of today. So it's important. We have a huge initiative to interview veterans in their own words, but then we also have a new exhibit, Voices from the Front, and that uses technology to extend sort of the conversations that we can have with veterans. It enables visitors to query our oral history interviews and receive a response using natural language processing and AI to some extent. So hearing the stories in the veterans' own words shows that these are real individuals, not just pages from a history book, but these are real human stories with real emotions and real personalities that people can really identify with.
All right, Tim, guys, thank you. Paratroopers played a key role in the D-Day invasion 80 years ago. And this week, hundreds of reenactors jumped from the sky to honor their bravery and sacrifice.
And our own Charlie Daggett made that very same jump over Normandy. And this is some of his story.
Not much has changed in the training of those paratroopers who risked and lost their lives storming into Normandy 80 years ago.
Half a pace, step forward, quick, march! Go!
How to jump, land,
run!
And pack your own parachute safely. A lot can go wrong, and mistakes can be fatal. In the Netherlands, we put that training to the test.
There are no practice runs for jumping.
We climbed to a height of 2,000 feet.
There's no turning back now.
In the door, Charlie. Hands down, hands down. Both hands.
I free fall for 5 terrifying seconds and then check to see if my parachute has fully opened.
I've got a good canopy. Easy. Brace for impact. Right.
That's a good landing. My first ever jump out of the way.
And Charlie is back on his feet, joins us now to speak about that incredible jump. You've got to, take us into the plane. What was that experience like for you? And for the point, how does it better put this all into perspective for us of what was done 80 years ago?
Yeah, Errol, the whole point of the exercise, that training that you saw there, that elegant jump and landing, was to kind of put ourselves in the footsteps. Maybe the boots would be a better description of the paratroopers, who landed that night. So as far as we were concerned, I've never jumped out of an aircraft before. You would have had young soldiers who had had a little bit of training. I mean, I don't want to downplay the 82nd and 101st. We're talking about actual airborne troops here. But yes, that's the same kind of chute that you're looking at right there that they jumped in. It is slightly controllable. There's a real jerk when you come out, but you have to make sure that your parachute is going to open. That's not always the case. You got to know when to go ahead for your reserve chute. If you get tangled up in the cords, jumping out of a C-47, which is what we did here, is not that Cessna. You don't sort of scoot your butt out. You run, and then you haul down. Now, all of those things can be potentially fatal if you don't get it right. But on top of that, what they were dealing with is coming into Normandy, the exact place that you're looking there. That is where they landed. They're landing there with 60, 70 pounds of equipment, rifles, and of course they're coming under anti-aircraft fire from the Germans. They don't know where they're going to land. And that was a huge issue for them. Figuring out how to control that parachute and hit that land. By the way, that's a good landing. To figure out how to get that landing in and that drop zone, they were scattered all over Normandy, and that slowed down the offensive here. And they're well behind enemy lines. Right. So in the dark, getting shot at, bad weather. Few of those C-47s went off course. A few of them were shot down. A lot of those paratroopers were dead before they hit the ground. A lot of them died on the ground. So it's just a hint of the challenges that they had to face that night and the next 2 nights.
And we do know more than 4,000 Allied troops lost their lives in
D-Day and then the invasion of Normandy. And I'm just thinking about your very soft landing. There was a smile on your face, and imagining what it would have been like for somebody who's dropping behind enemy lines 80 years ago tomorrow. What's the atmosphere like there, though, in Normandy today ahead of these ceremonies?
Yeah, Lana, you know, it's always very solemn, but there's thousands and thousands of people here. There are reenactors. There are people driving around in U.S. Jeeps. Everywhere you go, there are American flags. Of course, here at the American Cemetery, remembering 9,000 Americans who died here. We have these ceremonies tomorrow. So it's kind of hard to describe what it's like. So you have all these people who have come out from all over the world, many Americans here. The French are here. You know, when we landed, we were actually greeted by the French. So they're taking part in this. And I think what makes this a bit more poignant, we had the 75th, obviously that was huge because of its number, but the 80th, because of the nature of time, there are few people who were actual eyewitnesses, you know, the veterans that actually took part in D-Day. We've spoken to one or two of them ourselves, and I think there's a real sense that they have to keep this going. We have to keep remembering the sacrifice that happened here, especially with all the challenges that are facing not just the U.S. military, but Europe and other areas around the world.
That's a great point. And at the time, they were all so young, 18, 19, 20, 21, and not knowing what was happening next. And we're eternally thankful for their sacrifice, giving us the world we have today. And even to you, Charlie, for doing this for the first time, to take our viewers, giving them just a glimpse of what that was like. We appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
The hour had nearly come. Monday, June 5th, 1944. The evil of Hitler's Third Reich was devastating the world. Nazi Germany had subjugated the once free nations of Europe through brute force, lies, and twisted ideology of racial superiority. Millions of Jews murdered in the Holocaust. Millions of others killed by bombs, bullets, bloody warfare. Hitler and those with him thought democracies were weak, that the future belonged to dictators. Here, on the coast of Normandy, the battle between freedom and tyranny would be joined. Here, on that June morning, the testing was at hand. President Macron, Mrs. Macron, Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, distinguished guests, most of all, our honored veterans who met that test at the ages, a test of ages to that moment, 80 years ago. 80 years ago today. On behalf of the American people, and as Commander-in-Chief, it's the highest honor to be able to salute you here in Normandy once more. All of you, God love you. Winston Churchill called what happened here, quote, the greatest, most complicated operation ever, end of quote. After years of planning, Operation Overlord was ready to launch just as soon as the weather turned. Across the choppy English Channel, the Supreme Commander of the Allies, Dwight D. Eisenhower, waited. The largest force ever of its kind, built by 12 nations. Men, guns, planes, naval craft of every description waited. The world, captive and free, waited. Finally, Eisenhower's forecasters said there was a window in the weather. It would open briefly on Tuesday, the 6th of June. The general weighed the options and gave the order. At dawn, the Allies would strike. The great crusade to free Europe from tyranny would begin. That night, General Eisenhower drove to the English town of Newbury to visit paratroopers of the 101st Airborne. There were men from all over America. It was estimated that 80% of them would be killed within hours. That was the estimate. But they were brave, they were resolute, and they were ready. One soldier told General Eisenhower, quote, "Don't worry, sir. The 101st is on the job. Everything will be taken care of." That's what he said. And because of their courage and their resolve, because the courage and resolve of their allies, it was taken care of. From the sea and sky, nearly 160,000 Allied troops descended on Normandy. Many, to state the obvious, never came home. Many survived that longest day, kept on fighting for months until victory was finally won. And a few, a notable band of brothers, are here with us today. Kenneth Blaine Smith is here. On that day, under heavy artillery fire, he operated a rangefinder and radar on the first American ship to arrive at Normandy's coast, providing direct gunfire support for the Rangers scaling the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc on their daring mission to take out the German batteries. Bob Gibson is here. He landed on Utah Beach about 10 hours after the invasion began. Bullets flying everywhere, tracers lighting up the sky. Bob drove an M4 tractor with anti-aircraft gun mounted on top, providing critical protection for the infantry against the German Air Force. On that day, and for many days after, he continued. Ben Miller is here, a medic with the 82nd Airborne. At 3 a.m. on June 6th, he and 13 other medics flew over the channel in a rickety glider. Its wings were ripped off by giant poles that the Germans buried halfway in the ground to stop them from landing. They crashed, but they survived. And they did their duty, dragging injured soldiers to safety, treating wounds, saving lives while the battle raged. Every soldier who stormed the beach, who dropped by parachute or landed by glider, every sailor who manned the thousands of ships and landing craft, every aviator who destroyed German-controlled airfields, bridges, and railroads, all were backed by other brave Americans, including hundreds of thousands of people of color and women who courageously served despite unjust limitations on what they could do for their nation. Lewis Brown is here, part of the Red Ball Express, a truck convoy made up of mostly African-American drivers. They landed in Normandy in the wake of D-Day. They rushed supplies to the rapidly advancing front lines. Woody Woodhouse is here, members of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen, who flew over 15,000 sorties during the war. Marjorie Stone is here. She enlisted in the women's branch of the Naval Reserve, became an aircraft mechanic, spent the war keeping American planes and pilots in the air. Theirs has always been the story of America. Just walk the rows of this cemetery as I have. Nearly 10,000 heroes buried side by side, officers and enlisted, immigrants and native-born, different races, different faiths, but all Americans. All serve with honor when America and the world needed them most. Millions back home did their part as well. From coast to coast, Americans found countless ways to pitch in. They understood our democracy is only as strong as all of us make it together. The men who fought here became heroes, not because they were the strongest or toughest or most fiercest, although they were, but because they were given an audacious mission, knowing, every one of them knew, the probability of dying was real. But they did it anyway. They knew, beyond any doubt, there are things that are worth fighting and dying for. Freedom is worth it. Democracy is worth it. America is worth it. The world is worth it. Then, now, and always. The war in Europe didn't end for another 11 months. But here, the tide turned in our favor. Here, we proved the forces of liberty are stronger than the forces of conquest. Here, we proved that the ideals of our democracy are stronger than any army or combination of armies in the entire world. We proved something else here as well, the unbreakable unity of the Allies. Here with us are men who served alongside the Americans that day, wearing different flags on their arms, but fighting with the same courage for the same purpose. What the Allies did together 80 years ago far surpassed anything we could have done on our own. It was a powerful illustration of how alliances, real alliances, make us stronger. A lesson that I pray we Americans never forget. Together we won the war. We rebuilt Europe, including our former enemies. It was an investment in what became shared and a prosperous future. We established NATO, the greatest military alliance in the history of the world. And over time, you got it, it is. And over time, we brought more nations into NATO, the NATO alliance, including the newest members, Finland and Sweden. Today, NATO stands at 32 countries strong, and NATO is more united than ever, and even more prepared to keep the peace, deter aggression, defend freedom all around the world. America has invested in our alliances and forged new ones, not simply out of altruism, but out of our own self-interest as well. America's unique ability to bring countries together is an undeniable source of our strength and our power. Isolationism was not the answer 80 years ago and is not the answer today. We know the dark forces that these heroes fought against 80 years ago. They never fade. Aggression and greed, the desire to dominate and control, to change borders by force, these are perennial. The struggle between a dictatorship and freedom is unending. Here in Europe, we see one stark example. Ukraine has been invaded by a tyrant bent on domination. Ukrainians are fighting with extraordinary courage, suffering great losses, but never backing down. They've been inflicted on the Russian aggressors. They've suffered tremendous losses, Russia. The numbers are staggering. 350,000 Russian troops dead or wounded. Nearly 1 million people have left Russia because they can no longer see a future in Russia. The United States and NATO and a coalition of more than 50 countries standing strong with Ukraine. We will not walk away. Because if we do, Ukraine will be subjugated and will not end there. Ukraine's neighbors will be threatened. All of Europe will be threatened. And make no mistake, the autocrats of the world are watching closely to see what happens in Ukraine, to see if we let this illegal aggression go unchecked. We cannot let that happen. To surrender to bullies, to bow down to dictators is simply unthinkable. Were we to do that, it means we'd be forgetting what happened here in these hallowed beaches Make no mistake, we will not bow down. We will not forget. Let me end with this. History tells us freedom is not free. If you want to know the price of freedom, come here to Normandy. Come to Normandy and look. Go to the other cemeteries in Europe where our fallen heroes rest. Go back home to Arlington Cemetery. Tomorrow, I will pay respects at Pointe du Hoc. Go there as well and remember, the price of unchecked tyranny is the blood of the young and the brave. In their generation, in their hour of trial, the Allied forces of D-Day did their duty. Now the question for us is, in our hour of trial, will we do ours? We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944. Now we have to ask ourselves, will we stand against tyranny, against evil, against crushing brutality of the iron fist? Will we stand for freedom? Will we defend democracy? Will we stand together? My answer is yes, and only can be yes. We're not far off from the time when the last living voices of those who fought and bled on D-Day will no longer be with us. So we have a special obligation. We cannot let what happened here be lost in the silence of the years to come. We must remember it, must honor it, and live it. And we must remember the fact that they were heroes here that day does not absolve us from what we have to do today. Democracy is never guaranteed. Every generation must preserve it, defend it, and fight for it. That's the test of the ages. In memory of those who fought here, died here, literally saved the world here. Let us be worthy of their sacrifice. Let us be the generation that when history is written about our time, in 10, 20, 30, 50, 80 years from now, it'll be said, when the moment came, we met the moment. We stood strong. Our alliances were made stronger. We saved democracy in our time as well. Thank you very much, and may God bless you all, and may God protect our troops. Thank you.
We've just been listening to President Biden, and our CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has also been listening to the president. Ed, you are in Paris, not in Normandy, but, you know, we knew that he was going to talk about the need or reflect upon the connective tissue, if you will, between D-Day and the end of World War II and what we are seeing happening in Europe now. He talked about the war in Ukraine, and he alluded to Russia.
He did, Anne-Marie, and I'm sensitive to what else is going on here, so if we need to cut me off, please do. But this was a pretty aggressive speech that arguably had three audiences. One, Europe and the rest of the world, reinforcing the president's concerns about the struggle between democracy and autocracy. The American public, of course, as the American president, making sure they see him here, honoring those that served. But I'd argue there was a third audience, and it was pretty specific, and right there in front of him, dozens of lawmakers of both parties who came to Normandy today, many of whom were responsible for holding up funding to Ukraine over several months that U.S. military, Ukrainian military say held up and caused grave damage to Ukraine and its ability to fight Russia. So notable that he was so aggressive in those remarks, also because Russian officials in the past had attended these commemorations, and they were not invited by the French government to be here this year.